Hello and greetings from sunny Sun Valley, Idaho. Tonight I have the privilege of welcoming back to the Wagner Society of Washington, Heath Lees, to talk about Alex Ross's majestic work of last year, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Both Heath and I had the pleasure of interviewing Alex about the book, and I said last year that I thought the book, Wagnerism, is perhaps the most consequential book on Richard Wagner of our generation. I think Heath might agree. Heath Lees is Emeritus Professor of Music at Auckland, at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, but he's known throughout the world for helping us understand the very nature of music and the way music works. And he's especially known to Wagnerians for his monumental work on The Ring called A Tale Told Through Music. If you don't know this work, for heaven's sakes, get the CD or go online and watch it. It's truly a masterwork on the subject of The Ring. Well, enough from me. If you don't think Heath is prescient, let me remind you that he's coming to us tonight from the future, from Auckland, where it's already Friday. So without further ado, here is Heath Lees.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to you all at the Wagner Society of Washington, D.C., where I have very happy memories of a few days Wagner Society stay in 2014. And thanks too for this invitation and a warm welcome to its Zoom presentation, which I've called Wagnerism After Alex Ross. Recently, when I mentioned this title to Alex Ross himself, he joked that it sounded pretty ominous, especially for him. Although, of course, I knew it was a joke, but I duly explained that the idea of the talk would be to acknowledge the complete revision and recreation of the whole subject of Wagnerism after his book. No worries, he replied, I was kidding. Actually, it's very flattering to be periodized. Oh, I couldn't resist a final sign-off, and I said, not periodized, epochized, and I wasn't kidding. Alex Ross's book appeared nearly a year ago, and by now we've begun to really appreciate how much it has opened up a new epoch, a new era for Wagner studies, an era in which the phenomenon of Wagnerism has been for the first time looked at straight in the face, identified, embraced completely, and then presented to the world as a an exposition in one volume of nearly 800 pages. No single author has ever done this before, and my talk here aims to focus on some of the many ways in which Ross has unveiled the full phenomenon of Wagnerism for our age and beyond. At the start, some reviewers criticized this book, but of course, that's what reviewers do. Philosophers said they wanted more philosophy. Musicians regretted there wasn't enough actual music. And Wagner scholars, would you believe, wanted more about Wagner. But Ross's aim from the start was not to write a book on Wagner, but to reveal the nature, impact, and amazing spread of Wagnerism. And this he did spectacularly in a book that combined flamboyant exposition with dedicated and far-reaching scholarship. So yes, as I said, my title is Wagnerism After Alex Ross. But you might well ask, what about Wagnerism before Alex Ross? And you might be surprised to learn that since the beginning of serious writing on Wagner, from say 1850 onwards, none of the reviews, the surveys, the dictionaries, or the reference texts has ever acknowledged the cultural movement of Wagnerism as a study worthy of its subject study on its own. Look through all the reference books in English. You'll certainly find articles to do with Wagner, but you won't find one entry on the subject of Wagnerism. Even in the Mighty Groves Dictionary, which first appeared in 1879 and wended its way right through the 20th century to become Grove Online, even there is no standalone examination of Wagnerism. We had to wait for the composer's bicentenary year of 2013, when the Cambridge Wagner Encyclopedia was published, and finally awarded the subject a heading and a survey article of 3 pages. Yes, only 3, but it's a start. Of course, we know why scholars and authors have shied away from the subject of Wagnerism. It's because of the immensity of its domain, its worldwide reach, its many-sidedness. In the English language, the first book to venture into Wagnerism as both a phenomenon and a movement appeared in 1968. It ran to just under 100 pages, and it was carried out by an author who was neither a musician nor a historian of the theatre, but a philosopher, Brian McGee. And when he was writing, the word Wagnerism was almost non-existent in England, being regarded as a somewhat embarrassing idolatry created by French symbolists and decadents. So with his typical modesty, McGee called his book simply Aspects of Wagner. But he really meant Wagnerism. And when you read this book's half-dozen chapters about Wagner's revolution in opera, the Jewish questions he stirred up, the mighty impact he had on art, politics, and culture, you realize that McGee's book is Alex Ross's book in embryo. In fact, you might almost say that it is Alex Ross's book in prophecy. What do I mean by that? Well, in the text, Brian McGee actually envisages a complete book on Wagnerism as a standalone subject. The time has come, he says, to confront the Wagner phenomenon, to acknowledge and critically evaluate his influence on the culture of our age. To do this properly, he goes on, would itself require a book, and one that I am not equipped to write. Well, McGee was certainly not the only author to quail before the terrifying prospect of trying to contain Wagnerism within the covers of a single book. A couple of years ago, Alex Ross himself told me that he once received a letter from that very fine scholar, William Weber, from Long Beach, California, who admitted to him in a letter that he'd once considered authoring a book on Wagnerism, but gave up the idea quite soon after pondering on the vastness of the subject. On the other hand, William Weber does share the distinction with David Large of editing a book in 1984 that is the first single volume book in English that I can find with the word Wagnerism in its title. True, it limits itself to Europe, but it is a courageous, groundbreaking effort called Wagnerism in European Culture and Politics. Alas, these two editors chose to follow the ideas of their day, and they pronounced the death of Wagnerism in the 1920s, with its coup de grace being administered by World War I, and later having its tomb permanently sealed by the Nazis and World War II. But as Ross has brilliantly demonstrated in this book, Wagnerism has rebounded vigorously over the last century, becoming not just self-renewing, but time-traveling, boundary-breaking, culture-hopping, media-possessing. As a movement, it has grown to such enormous proportions that it's easy to see why no single author has dared to tackle it in a full-length study, until this book and Alex Ross. And this book has forcibly reminded us that Wagner was not just a wide-ranging dramatist and composer, but a world-embracing musical artist with a unique and powerful body of work, which in the second half of the 19th century took Europe by storm to such a degree that the cult of Wagner grew inexorably to become the ever-expanding universe of Wagnerism, a defining force, perhaps the defining force of European cultural history of the time. Or, Am I just getting carried away? Is this claiming too much by far? Some months ago, shortly after the book came out, I shared a web-based conversation with Alex Ross under the banner of the Wagner Society of New York. And I asked him if perhaps, as Wagner Society people, we might have gotten Wagnerism out of perspective. Maybe through time, I said, we had perhaps come to overstate his electrifying effect during his lifetime and his huge influence after. So here's me putting this to Alex Ross from that conversation. And his reply, please be kind, by the way, it's a re-recording of another Zoom event. So the sound's a bit patchy, but good enough, I hope. And there's a bit at the start of the book where you spell out the book's massive reach, and it is a massive reach. And you say, and I'm quoting here, Wagnerism was a cult that spread through the entire sphere of the arts, poetry, the novel, painting, theatre, dance, architecture, film, ... It also reached the realm of politics. Both the Bolsheviks in Russia and the Nazis in Germany used Wagner's music as a soundtrack. Wagner was arguably the presiding spirit of the bourgeois century that achieved its highest splendor around 1900 and then went to its doom. Wow. Wagner, the presiding spirit of a whole century. People might ask, are you not overdoing it? Was he really that important?
Well, of course, we know, so many of us know watching here that he was indeed such a towering figure, but it has been partly forgotten. You know, I think it comes as a surprise to realize how absolutely ubiquitous Wagner was in fin de siècle culture. How you really couldn't be a sort of rising young artist in that period without having some kind of stance on Wagner, even if it was to sort of completely reject him. Wagner was just sort of this object that you needed to kind of make your way around in one way or another. And so I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration because he was just this behemoth at the center of everything. And at the same time, I mean, there is a curious aspect to this book, which is really what drew me very much to the project as well, in that ultimately it is not so much about Wagner himself. It is about this period. It is about this expanse of culture in the fin de siècle, which is a period that I've just always been drawn to very strongly. And Wagner becomes the lens through which to view this period. And so it becomes sort of a history of the period told through Wagner.
So after Alex Ross, we have become the possessors of this 800-page book with its all-embracing survey and critique of Wagnerism, a mountain of work and influence that can now a mountain of work and influence that can now be acknowledged as a vast but well-defined and clearly mapped area of study. Dozens of movements and associations have been highlighted in this book, and the number of people Ross has singled out with a strong, often fervent connection to Wagnerism runs into hundreds. But in addition to supplying references and commentaries on all these, Ross has, as he says, and this is the really original part, actually gone beyond Wagnerism itself by turning it into a lens, which he then projects onto culture and society. Thus, the subtitle to his book, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. And it's a subtitle that prompts me towards my first bullet point. After Alex Ross, Wagnerism is now revealed as a standalone worldwide subject that has exerted enormous influence on the art, culture, and society of the time. This is the recognition that Brian McGee had been crying out for Wagner in 1968. Each of Ross's books, 800 pages, is conditioned by a dual purpose. Firstly, to lay bare the enormous scale and scope of Wagnerism as a movement, and secondly, to show how Wagnerism was assimilated, taken over, and pressed into service by writers, artists, mystics, political figures, religious leaders, and hosts of freebooters, all of them inspired by the intensity and transforming power of Wagner's art, and keen to ally it to the fast-changing beliefs and cultures of the modern age. And Ross was able to present this highly original, super expanded picture of the nature and influence of Wagnerism because he refused to see it as just another branch of music history, in the same way as he refused to see Wagner as just another Western composer. In his view, Wagnerism was never chained to the domain of music. On the contrary, he says, it formed a whole cultural milieu, an arts conglomerate that was initially rooted and grounded in music and drama, but spread vigorously outwards to embrace and to transform the widest range of other arts, activities, and ideas.
But basically, in my book, I kept calling him the composer, to avoid having the word Wagner, 3 times in every sentence. But he wasn't a composer, he was a dramatist, a composer and a dramatist and a theoretician and a conductor and a theater designer and a kind of part-time architect and a promoter and a festival planner. And so he filled so many roles. But the 2 essential roles were composer and dramatist. So his identity as a dramatist and as a person of the theater, I think, is so important. And people loved these texts, loved these stories. And Wagner was sometimes read before he was even heard. People would read the librettos before they heard a note of the music, or maybe they just heard an excerpt here and there. People read his prose writings before really seriously encountering the works. And so each of these components of the Wagner operation, the Wagner conglomerate, would kind of provoke conversations and debates, sort of each almost in a separate way. And I think the Wagner's eccentric strength as a dramatist has a great deal to do with why he had such a particularly profound effect on literature, even if ultimately music was the driving force. Music was what was most original and astonishing about Wagner. I mean, the librettos don't necessarily astonish you, overwhelm you, and transport you, as you read them on the page. The music does. The music did have this instantly entrancing power. And so that is ultimately
for a quick bird's eye view of the densely populated field of non-music artists and disciples who brought their commitment to Wagnerism into their lives and work, we might look at this striking off-the-wall publicity collage that appeared in September last year, around the time of the publication of the launch of Ross's book. It was put together by the presenters of the American radio program Book Music. It has few academic or Wagnerian pretensions, but I thought that it presented for us an admittedly small but nevertheless worthwhile thumbnail collection of a few of the major participants, a mini panorama, if you like, of the breathtaking reach of Wagnerism, as we have now recently come to understand it from the pages of Ross's book. This collage features a series of 8 snapshots from the 170-year history of Wagnerism, from just about 1850 to just about today. And its selection touches on many of the different countries, writers, artists, and art forms that were drawn into the whirlpool of Wagnerism. What is perhaps most striking about it is that there is no picture of Wagner himself, no direct reference to Wagner, not even an image of the set of a Wagner opera. The collage is all about Wagnerism. And nowadays, Wagner reception, i.e. the impact of Wagner and his work on adjacent arts and artists, contingent movements and flamboyant borrowings, even outrageous parodies. As well as there being no picture of Wagner there, the omission of another later figure is also noteworthy, Adolf Hitler, who most people think chose Wagner as his favorite composer and tried to raise him up to become the voice of the all-conquering nation, even in the death camps. Thankfully now, after Alex Ross's book, we have an honest, more mature, certainly more balanced picture. And hopefully, if you've had a chance, you might have read already the appropriate chapter of the book to appreciate fully what has emerged here by way of truth and perspective. In any event, maybe it's just as well that Hitler doesn't appear in this collage, since he always confuses the picture of Wagnerism. Another notable absentee from this mini gallery is Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who was for many years a friend of the Wagners, and who, along with the poet Baudelaire in France, was one of the very first pioneer Wagnerians. Both Nietzsche and Baudelaire hailed Wagner as a long-awaited bringer of modernism, that excitingly disruptive movement in arts, literature, and worldview from the 1870s to the 1920s, a movement where rebellious artists were intent on driving a wedge between themselves and their conventional view of the past, especially of their immediate 19th century past. So this brings us to our second bullet point, and here it comes now. After Alex Ross, Wagnerism now marks the birth of modernism. Into this revolt of the modernists, Wagner was an ideal fit. His modernism was easy to see. He had brought the multicolored textures of the contemporary orchestra into action, along with new roles for musical harmony and unprecedented demands on the vocal performers. Yet at the same time, he had grounded his subjects in days of old, in myth and legend, and in ancient and medieval history. Such modernist juxtaposing of the past with contemporary ideas and techniques yielded untried linkages that were rich and strange and new. So new indeed that Wagner was actually to take the breathtaking step of seizing upon an early insult and announcing his art as the music drama of the future. Nietzsche tended towards a more historical view of Wagnerism, one that stretched back through time to Greek theatre. When he observed Wagner's shaping and ordering language being invaded by his modern musical intensity, he thought in terms of the god Apollo, the god of form and harmony, struggling to achieve a balance with Dionysus, the god of frenzy and spiritual ecstasy. Or he might just have used Wagner's own terms from Wagner's book Opera and Drama, and hailed it as a modernist fusion of understanding with feeling. Let me get back to Nietzsche for a second, who appears as your first Wagnerian. Would you say he was the first real Wagnerian?
No, in fact, Baudelaire was the first real Wagnerian. But Nietzsche is a great place to begin.
The step from Nietzsche to Baudelaire is interesting because they both shared this fascination with not just the hypnotic, magical spell of the music, but also with the notion that Wagner was ushering in the kind of modernism that they were dreaming of. In fact, you use a phrase from Nietzsche throughout the book. You repeat it over like a leitmotif. And it's the bit when he says, Wagner sums up modernity. It can't be helped. One must first become a Wagnerian. Can you speak about this modernism that Wagner ushered in through Wagnerism?
Yes, well, it's, of course, the word modernism or the word modernity. I mean, these are slippery concepts, which sort of the possible meanings and interpretations of them proliferate wildly. For Nietzsche, I think it had a sort of more specific and also somewhat sardonic meaning. I sort of, Wagner's modernity kind of elided in his mind with decadence, with a sort of modern, somewhat kind of untethered and sort of ungrounded kind of existence from which Nietzsche himself actually wanted to really break away from this particular form of modernity. But at the same time, I mean, it sort of has to be a compliment at the same time for him to sort of coin that famous phrase, "You first must be Wagnerian," and sort of, you know, sort of coming to terms with Wagner is part of this process of becoming modern. So I think it's not simply sort of pejorative in that sense. And, you know, there's a bigger implication that automatically comes into play with that word modernity, including sort of Baudelaire's modernity. And Nietzsche, by the time he was writing that, was well acquainted with Baudelaire's writing on Wagner and his personal experiences with Wagner. And he said I think he said more or less that sort of Baudelaire was the first Wagnerian, or sort of this phenomenon really takes root in France. It was really the French who properly understood Wagner. And it was this argument pointed against the kind of official national German interpretation of Wagner. And so Nietzsche was rejecting that and sort of putting forward an idea of a more cosmopolitan Wagner, and sort of the French Wagner. And so by bringing in this kind of French understanding of modernity, modernité, this engages with Baudelaire's understanding of that word, which is something rather different. You know, for Baudelaire, the modern was a kind of urban experience of these sort of, you know, fleeting, fragmentary states of being. And so with Baudelaire, Wagner becomes something almost indistinguishable from French Bohemia and sort of the forces and ideas that animated French Bohemia and the avant-garde, and sort of this portal to some other dimension, to a dream world, to the unconscious, to a state of extreme sensuality. And he talks about, you know, in Tannhäuser, the counter-religion, a sort of satanic religion sort of emanating from the Venusberg. And these ideas are very, very different, of course, from the discourse that you know, animated Wagnerism in Germany. And so, you know, I see Baudelaire as the original Wagnerian in this sense of Wagnerism, sort of a figure of this international movement called Wagnerism, because he is reinventing Wagner, because he is transplanting Wagner into his own sphere and using Wagner as a tool to advance his own ideas. And sort of that pattern of Wagner being appropriated to so many different ends, and being sort of captured by so many different movements and philosophies and ideologies is really at the core of the story.
The modernism that Baudelaire saw in Wagnerism included a state of extreme sensuality, says Ross, who you've just heard describe Baudelaire's reaction to Wagner's music as a portal to some other dimension, to a dream world, to the unconscious. As we know from Baudelaire's other confessions of listening to Wagner's music, the poet's real Wagnerism came to life in his poetic Bohemian modernism, his sheer delight in the transport that the music brought, a state of blissful stimulation, where the mind freely tagged along, feeding random poetic ideas that didn't try to explain the music, but mixed in along with it, while animating the imagination towards a delicious unknown. This was the early modernists' real committed Wagnerism, and Baudelaire was the first to put it rhapsodically into words. For example, when he was completely carried away by his first hearing of the prelude to Wagner's Lohengrin. I found myself imagining the delicious state of a man in the grip of a profound reverie, in an absolute solitude, a solitude with an immense horizon and a wide diffusion of light, an immensity with no other decor but itself. Soon I experienced the sensation of a brightness more vivid, an intensity of light growing so swiftly that not all the nuances provided by the dictionary would be sufficient to express this ever renewing increase of incandescence and heat. Then I came to the full conception of the idea of a soul moving about in a luminous medium, of an ecstasy composed of knowledge and joy, hovering high above the natural world. Decadent, dreamlike, says Baudelaire, a profound reverie, and most striking of all, an ecstasy composed of knowledge and joy. Clearly, Baudelaire had fully grasped the Wagnerian idea of the head working in concert with the heart, the mind creating an ecstatic fusion with the emotions. But then, Wagner himself had described exactly this double-headed ecstasy in the third volume of his opera and drama, a work that Baudelaire had read in an English translation. There, Wagner spoke of his mission to have poetic language working as a loving partner with music. He described it frankly as a sexual coupling, the male fertilizing seed of the poet, bringing the gift of conception within a conjoined female music that offered itself, in Wagner's words, as the soil of infinite universal feeling. The music embodies the poetic words at the same time as the language suggests meanings to the music. And for the concentrating listener, the whole effect flares into an ecstatic act of expanded recognition. In 1860, in a famous letter to Wagner, Baudelaire exclaimed that he had taken possession of the music as his own. Il me semblait, he said, que cette musique était la mienne. I felt that this music was mine. This is the kernel of what Baudelaire described as Wagner's passionate energy of expression, making him, he said, the truest representative of modernity. Nietzsche, in 1869, after attending his first performance of a Wagner opera, wrote, "I had the liveliest impression of suddenly finding myself at home in my element." Years later, though disenchanted with Wagner as a person, he remained loyal to the composer's overwhelmingly contemporary effects and concluded that Wagner was the only gateway to modernism. "You must first become a Wagnerian," he said, in a motto phrase that became a leitmotif for this book. As we've noted already, though, Alex Ross goes beyond all this and moves on into fresh territory. He moves from simply describing Wagnerism to exposing the uses to which his followers put it. And here again, Baudelaire was first. Just before his death, Baudelaire wrote a collection of poems in prose, which were clearly fashioned after Wagner's long and supple musical paragraphs, avoiding traditional symmetries and cadences, but following instead their own spontaneous flow within self-sown fields of musical resonance, the clear model being Wagner's so-called endless melody. In his preface, Baudelaire admits he is attempting to take possession of music in this writing, and the kind of music he has in mind has the name Wagner written all over it. "Who among us," writes Baudelaire, "has not dreamt of the miracle of a poetic prose, musical without regular rhythm and rhyme, but supple and staccato enough to adapt to the lyrical stirrings of the soul, the undulations of dreams and sudden leaps of consciousness." Much of this passage seems to have been taken straight out of Wagner's 1861 booklet to the French, his Lettres sur la musique, in particular a section on Tristan, which also speaks of the music embodying the interior movements of the soul. Other movers and shakers in this little gallery of people putting Wagnerism to their own purposes include at the top of the right-hand panel there, Marcel Proust, whose À la recherche du temps perdu, in search of lost time, is given Ross's major distinction of being the grandest of all the many multi-part novels that were written in the first few decades of the 19th century. Not all of them acknowledged Wagner's four-opera ring cycle as their model, but clearly all of them were influenced by it. Ross lists Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage novels, Roland Rolland's Jean Christophe, and others. Proust also takes the Wagnerian leitmotif and transplants it smoothly into his writing. Most Wagner scholars have fastened on his famous, almost synesthetic motif of the Madeleine dipped in tea as his most impactful kind of leitmotif, I said. But typically, Alex Ross finds others, and he went far deeper in his book and homed in on a quite different 1893 story, The Melancholy Summer of Madame de Brive. Here, Proust uses Hans Sachs' Flieder monologue from as the key to Madame's barely conscious thoughts. And taking yet another cue from Wagner, Proust describes this scene in sentences of kaleidoscopic heavenly length, rather like Baudelaire's poems en prose, and patterned after Wagner's endless melody, but so that one special phrase stands out here and there, the way leitmotifs do in Wagner's usage. Proust was a thoroughgoing Wagnerian. An earlier instance of his alliance with leitmotifs was in Swann's Way, where we encounter the famous petite phrase of 5 notes which cannot be shaken off, but act as an anthem, a reminiscence, a background, a symbol, and so on. The phrase takes on obsessive significance. The similarity with Leopold Bloom in James Joyce's Ulysses leaps to mind, with the constant recurrence of a number of unshakable phrases, such as Laci darem la mano from Don Giovanni, coming back repeatedly like a leitmotif, while Bloom continues his journey through the streets of Dublin. Alex Ross explains that, always reluctant to admit his Wagnerism, James Joyce, who you see at the bottom of the right-hand panel, also took over the long, rolling Wagnerian phrases via Marcel Proust from Wagner and pressed them into the service of his famous so-called interior monologue, or stream of consciousness. Just listen to the bobbing, unordered polyphony going on in Bloom's mind when he's suddenly reminded of an inquest he had recently attended. That afternoon of the inquest, the red-labelled bottle on the table, the room in the hotel with hunting pictures, stuffy it was. Sunlight through the slats of the Venetian blind, the coroner's sunlit ears, big and hairy. Boots, giving evidence, thought he was asleep first, then saw like yellow streaks on his face, had slipped down to the foot of the bed. Verdict, overdose. Death by misadventure. The letter, for my son Leopold. No more pain. Wake no more. Down in the bottom left-hand corner is Gabriele D'Annunzio, one of the more famous or infamous of the Italian Wagnerians. D'Annunzio is intriguing because, of course, of his life and career, but more so for us, and particularly for Alex Ross, because of his Wagnerian novels. He was a fighter pilot and a war hero who fell under Wagner's spell in the early 90s. It came about through listening to Tristan and Isolde, played by a friend on the piano 10 times at the one sitting, so the story goes. D'Annunzio survived the marathon supremely well, but no one tells us about the state of the pianist at the end. Ross finds D'Annunzio somewhat unique, partly because famous Italian Wagnerians were not thick on the ground, and because D'Annunzio took over not just Wagner's aesthetic ideals, but his political resonances as well, when he championed a fusion of art and politics, art and life being formed into an all-consuming Gesamtkunstwerk, or all-embracing artwork. D'Annunzio began as a follower of aestheticism, but by 1920, he had refashioned himself as a proto-fascist leader, the commandante of the city-state of Fiume. His Wagnerian novels were saturated in Wagner. The stories, the characters, the transfixed states, all of them projected through long, circular, poetic language that flourished into yet another prose version of Wagner's endless melody that here bespeaks more endless transformation. In his book, Ross lets us savor a little of this from the 1894, the novel The Triumph of Death, a very Isolde-like passage that appears just before the lover's suicide. The sorceress of Ireland, the formidable mistress of philters, the poisoner, the homicide, became transfigured by the power of death into a being of light and of joy, exempt from all impure lust, free from all base attachment, throbbing and respiring in the breast of the diffused soul of the universe. As usual, Ross has just the right phrase for such magnificent over-the-top purple prose. He calls it a pyrotechnic elaboration, both of Wagner's text and of his endless melody. At the top left-hand corner, we move into the fine arts, another area where Wagner was very much a powerful influence. And Alex Ross goes into that area, the area of the fine arts, sallying in his uninhibited but highly informative way. The painting you see there comes from 1916 and is one of a huge series of 144 watercolor and graphite pieces by the Swedish artist and mystic Hilma af Klint. The whole series is called the Parsifal series, and this one is entitled Parsifal and the Atom. Almost ignored for decades, Hilma af Klint has recently become recognized in art circles, thanks to a very successful exhibition in New York's Guggenheim Museum. The exhibition closed in 2019 and began a world tour, which is still going on. In fact, at this moment, thank you very much, it is about to open in Wellington, New Zealand. If you had managed to see this exhibition in a city close to you, you would have been able to decide for yourself the effect of this theosophist and Wagnerian who used music as a model for escaping realism and symbolism in her work, moving instead into abstract art considerably before Mondrian and that other very Wagnerian painter, Kandinsky. Needless to say, Alex Ross makes and elaborates on these artistic connections and brings the obvious element of Wagnerism to the fore. The Parsifal series, he says, progresses from images of dark confinement to a shimmering chromatic spectrum of squares and circles. It suggests, says Ross, a journey of initiation, like Parsifal's long, fitful progress towards the Grail. It might just form the invisible theatre of which Wagner frequently spoke, and which a poet like Mallarmé frequently echoed. Another influential Wagnerian woman appears in the middle of the right-hand panel. One of Ross's most important legacies is, in fact, in bringing to light the many and varied contributions that women made to Wagnerism, from arranging and hosting myriad Wagner performances in society to undertaking important and direct artistic work in art and literature as well as on the stage. Isadora Duncan, for that's who it is, saw herself as an alternative to the Wagner stage play. Her dancing body was itself an expressive embodiment of the narrative on Wagner's work. And she frequently danced to Wagner's music in London, Paris, Bayreuth, and in New York's Carnegie Hall. She did as much for the spread of Wagner's music as she did for the beginning of modern dance. And speaking of modern, the very contemporary subject of Wagner and film rears its head here. As you'll know, it's frequently claimed that Wagner was made for film and film was made for Wagner. Wolfgang Wagner repeatedly said that if he were living in the world today, his grandfather, Richard Wagner, would undoubtedly be working for Hollywood. It's certainly true that Wagner predicts film, and his Bayreuth theatre anticipated cinema, what with its darkened auditorium and big screen-like confrontational stage, to say nothing of a hidden orchestra below, providing the soundtrack. One perhaps less welcome observation from Ross is that the easygoing copyright piracy of the American scene meant that European cultural landmarks at the time could be pressed into mass entertainment. And the movies, of course, did just that. Even nowadays, look at the bottom there. Most people who haven't heard the names of Wagner's operas know this classic, lovingly restored 80-year-old Bugs Bunny cartoon called What's Opera, Doc?, where Elmer Fudd hits his wabbity archenemy with everything he's got, including the heaviest Wagner he can find. And this, of course, just has to be The Ride of the Valkyrie.
Wabbit-wax. Kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit. Kill the wabbit.
Of course, it was the live orchestra Wagner pillaged score for D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, that set the pace for a century of Wagnerian aggression on film. And it's that aggression that Ross brings out and concentrates on. In his words, more than 1,000 movies have had the composer on their soundtracks, using him to unleash all manner of rampaging hordes, marching armies, swashbuckling heroes, and scheming evildoers. The Ride has figured in a particularly dizzying range of situations, most chillingly, most recently, and most memorably in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Fasten your seatbelts. Georg Scholti and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra in full cry. So there we are, a final frightening fortissimo for our very selected round trip kind of snapshot presentation of the comprehensive Wagnerism that Alex Ross has drawn out, displayed, and left to posterity. At this point, though, we might gain a fuller and longer view by spinning through Ross's huge linear panorama of Wagnerism legacy, as shown in the book's chapter headings. And there are many more things that we can pick out as we pass. We've already looked at Wagner, Nietzsche, and the Ring, but Ross spends a lot of time on the Ring in his first chapter. What I like about him is the music-centered way in which he uses this material. Always you find that the music is to the fore, and he is so able to describe the music in such an expressive, true-to-life fashion that it makes a total difference from a lot of other, much more academic writers about Wagner and Wagnerism. In the second chapter, he moves on again to a poet, one we've mentioned before, Baudelaire and the French, particularly the French symbolists. Ross is particularly vivid in what he tells us about Baudelaire. Listen to his summing up. The poet, Baudelaire he means, who contrasted muses and Madonnas with temptresses and whores, was well prepared for the Elizabeth-Venus duality of Tannhäuser. On the purely musical level, Wagner's investigation of unusual harmonies and timbres accorded with Baudelaire's ideas about the beauty of the ugly and the bizarre. In the French press, Berlioz had accused Wagner of making the horrible beautiful and the beautiful horrible. In a great flash of insight, Alex Ross claims that Baudelaire might have loved the music for exactly this reason. Here in chapter 3, Ross's survey combines Lohengrin with Victorian England, the pre-Raphaelites, William Morris, the pompous English Wagner review called The Meister, and then, taking a sudden transatlantic leap, moves far away from pious English Wagnerism to a fun-loving Gilded Age America, a description which, as you'll know, comes from a novel by Mark Twain. This was the wonderful time of the enormously popular Wagner seasons at that pleasure-loving Sodom by the Sea, Coney Island, plus various associated so-called Parsifal entertainments. Ross admits that being so far away, America was able freely to view Wagnerism through its own eyes. But then, says Ross, so did most other countries. Each country, he says, saw Wagner through a self-fashioned prism. For the French, he was a torchbearer of the modern. For the British, a messenger of the figures of King Arthur's court. In the United States, Wagner harmonized with a national love of wilderness sagas, frontier lore, Native American tales, stories of desperados searching for gold. Chapter 4, back in Europe, Wagnerism was always in the thick of other people's richly alternative creeds and mysticisms. Alex Ross has one packed paragraph that lists some, but not all of these. It was, he says, the age of esotericism, occultism, Satanism, spiritism, theosophy, Swedenborgism, mesmerism, Martinism, and Kabbalism. Reinventions or fabrications of medieval sects multiplied, the Knights Templar, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and various Rosicrucian orders which sought to revive Renaissance alchemical and necromantic lore of obscure origin. Wagner, says Ross, blended readily with these mystical milieu. True, and what a shopping list. The Kaiserreich and fin de siècle Vienna. This refers to the period from 1871 to 1918, a period during which the art of music became the symbol of Austro-German might and grandeur. In the first year of the Kaiserreich, the Beethoven centenary took place, and Wagner, still flushed with the huge success of his echt German opera Die Meistersinger, wrote his influential essay entitled Beethoven, in which he deftly assumed the mantle of the earlier composer. At the same time, says Alex Ross, Wagner's music now signified the military might of the new German nation. Goodness, the Emperor Wilhelm II wore his admiral's uniform to performances of the Flying Dutchman. He attended Bayreuth, but soon tired of it, and took more pleasure from driving around in his shiny new motor car with a horn that pumped out Donner's thunder motif from Das Rheingold. Wagner had become the empire's cultural badge. He was not just an official artist, but a mass market commodity. In terms of political idolizing, just look at the high-class chocolate box splendor of Anton von Werner's famous painting of the 1903 unveiling of Gustav Eberlein's godlike statue of Wagner in the Berlin Tiergarten. The next two chapters whiz from the hoi polloi of Germany to the other end of the social spectrum in their attention to oppressed minority communities that make up such an original and frequent context for Alex Ross's presentation of Wagnerism. But remember that he's told us that he's observing the mores of the time through the impact and legacy of Wagnerism. Although many Wagnerian anti-Semites, and for that matter, Jewish Wagnerites, have appeared in other books on Wagner, Alex Ross's gallery includes many new cases and much fascinating new research on already known ones. In his section on Black Wagner, new lights are brought to bear on previously unnoticed people of color. People such as W.E.B. Du Bois, co-founder of the NAACP. For Du Bois, Wagnerism simply transcended the struggles of race, as witness an aperçu that he wrote in 1936, having just visited Wagner's grave. The musical dramas of Wagner, wrote Du Bois, tell of human life as he lived it, and no human being, white or black, can afford not to know them if he would know life. And the chapter on feminist and gay Wagner covers a perhaps surprisingly large list of characters and reminds us that in its early days, Bayreuth had a widely acknowledged gay ambience, while women writers in particular were drawn into European lesbian company on the continent. Ross instances Violet Paget, who presided over lesbian circles in both London and Florence. She presented the composer in her 1911 essay, The Religious and Moral Status of Wagner, as a kind of Venus flytrap for vulnerable souls. We're halfway through the chapter headings, but let's break off for a moment to note that the study of these often oppressed minority groups frequently brings Ross into the territory of the evolving, multiracial, multi-stranded society of America. As you might expect from a man who's plied his trade, music critic for the New Yorker for more than 2 decades, Ross keeps a close attention to the American scene. And this book on Wagnerism frequently focuses on your country, the country that Wagner studies in the past, even though Wagner sometimes voiced a desire to move there as to pastures new. This subject, Wagner in America, is so new, so fully treated here, and so incisively original that I felt it should be given a whole bullet point to itself. And here it comes. After Alex Ross, Wagnerism in America has now been awarded its due prominence. Before Alex Ross, the feisty subject of Wagnerism in America was mostly a closed book for non-Americans, and until recently, not a well-trodden path even for US Wagnerians, with one shining exception, that is, the book Wagner Nights by Joseph Horowitz, which was published in 1994 and really opened up the American frontier of Wagnerism. Much of the book centers around the figure of a famous Wagner evangelist, the transplanted European Wagner conductor Anton Seidl. And this worked fine for Horowitz's purpose, which was to document the spread of Wagner knowledge and Wagner performance in America. But again, Alex Ross goes deeper, and he shows not just how Wagnerism brought changes to America, but how America assimilated and even wrought its own changes to Wagnerism.
Then there's sort of this curious adaptation that takes place where the Wagner heroes are melded with American kind of ideal heroic figures and sort of the sort of solitary hero of the Wild West. And so one thing I talk about is Owen Wister's classic Western novel, The Virginian, and how Wister himself was an avid Wagnerite. He actually went to see the premiere of Parsifal in 1882. He had ambitions early on to be a composer, and then he turned into the sort of popular author and wrote this best-selling Western, which became really a founding work of Western literature. But the hero, who's known only as the Virginian, and we never learned his actual name, seems in many ways a kind of updating of Lohengrin. And there's sort of clues in the book that might be a good way to approach him. And when Wister went west for the first time, he kind of saw the landscape too through Wagnerian eyes. In his diary, he compared it to the set of Die Walküre. And there are sort of other figures. Sidney Lanier, the poet, was very interested in Wagner. I talk about the more glancing kind of Wagner commentaries of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman and some others. And it's a rich field. I think American Wagnerism was just very much its own creature, its own organism. And I was fascinated always by these geographical variations in Wagnerism as you go from place to place.
For many readers, a major revelation from the point of view of Wagnerism in America was in the dazzling spotlight and extended treatment that Ross gave to the writer Willa Cather, who gets a whole chapter to herself in the exact center of the book. There she exhibits a clear, straight-shooting Wagnerism, but it's a Wagnerism of a double-barreled type. That's to say, she uses it in Ross's film theory terms diegetically, as a prominent subject in her stories, and non-diegetically as an overarching inspiration for those frequent pages where the thrust of her work turns musical. And more yet, she was herself a reviewer for many Wagner performances in Pittsburgh, and she made it her business to get to know the world of opera from the inside. Thanks to Ross's book, Willa Cather has now been thrust into the spotlight as an important figure in Wagnerism in general and in literary Wagnerism in particular. Ross fell in love with Willa Cather and her writing all over again, as he tells us in this confession of how he more drawn by her, more haunted by her, more attracted to her work.
I mean, she did write an entire novel about a Wagner soprano, or sort of the early life, the training of a Wagner soprano, The Song of the Lark. And there are a number of her early stories which revolve around scenes of people listening to Wagner or playing Wagner, and some more glancing mentions in a number of the other novels. So this was a lifelong interest that Cather had in Wagner. And yeah, I'm not sure if anyone had quite expounded it at such length, or I think especially given Cather such prominence in the international pantheon of Wagnerian artists and authors. So you don't find Cather present so strongly in some other accountings of this territory. And so I think she deserved that close focus. And in fact, this is the only chapter in the book that's devoted to a single figure. Every other chapter sort of sprawls and sort of encompasses a great many figures all at once. And so Cather has a chapter to herself. And I think it's just, in a book that does sort of range as widely as mine and sort of engages with hundreds ultimately of figures, even if only briefly, it's good to kind of stop and zero in on a single figure. And I mean, you mentioned sort of this feeling of discovery, and Cather was to some extent a discovery for me. I'd read some of her work before I set to work on this book more than 10 years ago, but I wouldn't describe myself as would not have described myself as a Cather devotee. And I became one. I really fell completely in love with the work, and I delved into the world of Cather's studies. I went several times to Red Cloud, the Nebraska town where she grew up, and went to the Cather archives in Lincoln and met a lot of people in those communities. And it was a very enriching experience for me. So yeah, I think the depth of that chapter kind of reflects my own the sort of the joy of that kind of immersion in the subject.
Today, we all reap special benefit from the last chapters of Alex Ross's book, where he casts the widest net over Wagnerism and brings it right up to date for the 21st century. The first all-embracing examination within the covers of one book of the last century of Wagnerism. It covers some of the major movements of the 20th century, movements including all the isms of the early years of the 20th century, and also the political movements that were a feature of this part of the modern heritage: revolution in Russia, Nazi Germany. Culturally, he moves on to Ulysses, the Wasteland, and the Waves, and does a huge, deep study of James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Virginia Woolf, three authors whose deeply rooted Wagnerism is brought to shining light in this closing survey. A whole chapter on film And at the end, Wagnerism after 1945, which gives me my last bullet point, which is after Wagnerism in America, Wagnerism has been thoroughly updated thanks to this book for the 21st century now. And these are major bullet points that I've taken out of the study of Wagnerism after Alex Ross. And so this book makes it clear that contrary to what some other writers have claimed, Wagnerism did not die in the 1920s after the First World War. Indeed, Wagnerism was so strong that it survived the ruination of the Nazi era and took off again in new directions and to new places. Ross writes that in the post-war era, radical directors have reinvented the operas on stage. Fantasy epics like Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and Game of Thrones have rejuvenated Wagner's mythic devices, consciously or not. The mysticism of Parsifal wafted through the later novels of Philip K. Dick. Musicologists and historians have excavated half-forgotten understandings of the composer and thrown light on alternative Wagnerisms that lie at the heart of Ross's story. Socialist Wagner, feminist Wagner, gay Wagner, black Wagner, theosophical Wagner, satanic Wagner, Dadaist Wagner, sci-fi Wagner, global Wagner movements that rose and fell under different names and have gradually formed themselves into the 150 Wagner societies of today, the Wagner Society of Paris, the London Wagner Society, the Wagner Society of Washington, D.C. And this acknowledgement of Wagner societies brings us full circle and back to the phenomenon of your invitation to me for this event designed to keep the Wagner flag flying during COVID lockdowns, when meetings and performances are inhibited. To finish then, after Alex Ross, you and I are now the beneficiaries of a huge, unique, and lasting resource on Wagner and Wagnerism. Remember how Ross put it at the start? It's not just the study of Wagnerism through the politics and culture of the age, he said, but a study of the politics and culture of the age through Wagnerism. That's the new approach that has really put this subject on the map. And it's created what, taking a leaf out of Wagner's many books, we might call the Wagner study of the future. It will certainly be fascinating to see where our understanding of Wagner, and of course particularly of Wagnerism, goes from here after Alex Ross. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Anybody?
Yep.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Wow. Heath, that was a survey and condensed meaningfully on a par with Alex Ross's book itself, in my view. You know, if you'll indulge me for a moment, one of the things I like to do is find out more about our speakers. And at the Wagner Society over the last 25 years, we have always asked our speakers, and I don't think this is too far afield from Wagnerism and the subject you've been talking about, but that is, have you, and would you care, if you have, to share with us was there an initial epiphanic Wagner moment in your musical life or otherwise?
Well, I suppose, is it all right if I have two?
Yes, so you may have two.
The first one actually was a sort of bequest from my father, who was a musician and who looked after many of the schools in Lanarkshire and Scotland as music organizer for the county. And he used to be fond of Wagner, used to play it a bit. I never took much notice of it. And then suddenly I heard this Wotan's Farewell, as I later discovered it was, wafting through the house. And it was that that attracted me. I just loved its epic quality. And I was working at music at the time and studying Wagner's harmony and compositional methods and so on. And suddenly this just seemed to take off into my active life, and I loved it, and I never stopped loving it after that. I remember Stuart Skelton telling me that when he was doing Valkyrie as Siegmund, he always waited on to the end of the opera because he said, I'm only going to get in my life a certain number of times when I can hear Wotan's Farewell, and I don't want to miss any of them. And I was kind of caught the same way. Well, I said there were two. Another one was in the 1990s, before we had started the Wagner Society of New Zealand. And there was a man called, with a wonderful Wagnerian name of Alan Brabant. And he was a builder. He used to come off the building sites. And I think one of the things I love about Wagner is the way it appeals to everybody, no matter what their background. This is something that comes up in Alex Ross's book as well. And this man wrote, would you believe, to Wolfgang Wagner. And he pointed out that there was this crazy man in New Zealand doing lots of talks and lectures on Wagner. And he, Alan Brabant, thought that I should be invited to Bayreuth. So I got this letter one day out of the blue from not Wolfgang Wagner, but his wife at the time, Gudrun Wagner, who offered both Liz and me a couple of tickets to Bayreuth. And we went there and we saw Tristan at the time and Parsifal. These were the only two left to run on that season. And that was another wonderful moment, another epiphanic moment, as you say. So I had two of them, really. One of them right at the start as a raw youth, and one of them as I was beginning really to get a Wagner Society going in New Zealand and running lectures and courses and things. And it really made me feel there was an organic reality about Wagner that I hadn't appreciated more. And that organic reality comes back again, I think, in the 800 pages of Alex Ross's book.
It seems to me when you talked about your first bullet point, that Wagner's now revealed as a standalone and worldwide figure. And there's a curious asymmetry or symmetry. On the one hand, I think Alex's book has introduced me certainly to 400 or 500 people, artists, with which I had little or no familiarity. And I wonder if one of the great gifts of this book is, and I say reference work in the highest possible meaning of that word, because you can look at so-and-so in a paragraph or a page or two, and then your curiosity might take over and you say, who was this fellow or this woman? And wow, doesn't this deserve a further exploration? Did it strike you that way?
Oh, yes, very much so. In another double-headed way, it struck me that the word Wagnerism had come to life because, as I said right at the start of my talk, the idea of Wagnerism had never been put up as a single standalone study subject. And this is something that I think Alex Ross has done for all of us. He's created a kind of lighthouse, a beacon of Wagnerism. And I think too that, and this is the second part, that it has made that huge global survey that you just talked about real for a whole lot of people, and yes, thrown out all kinds of flashes into the world that people want to try and follow up on. There's another way in which the impact, the huge impact of Wagnerism through this book has affected everybody, I think, and that is that they have also, as well as what you've said, they also discovered other artists, other people, and suddenly discovered that these artists and other people were affected by Wagnerism, and we didn't know that. I remember, for example, there's a bit in the book that talks about Van Gogh, for example. And I didn't know that Van Gogh was affected so much by Wagner, and this book told me that this is what happened. And there are so many others around the book, not just people I didn't know about, but people I knew about but didn't know about their Wagnerism. And yes, I think this book has done that. And now, after Alex Ross, we have a huge panorama of people that we're all beginning to digest and redigest. And that's a wonderful contribution for the book to have made.
When I said double-headed, I wanted to reflect it back now the opposite direction. Alex's book and the follow-on to Alex's book does it, and to what extent do you think this is going to reflect back on Wagner himself? And what I mean by that is, in a positive way, our lives have been enriched by Wagner, as well as Beethoven or Mozart or Joyce, but particularly enriched by Wagner. In a negative sense, I think all of us, all Wagnerians, we carry a little chip on our shoulder, because if you ask somebody in the street about Wagner, we'd get the cliche. We would get Hitler, we would get Bugs Bunny, we would get the Ride of the Valkyries. Is there a kind of, do you think, active, academically or otherwise, reverse effect of Alex's book, which reflects back more and more positively on Wagner himself?
Yes, and on Wagner's music and on the experience of listening to Wagner. A lot of us, and you must feel this too, we do have friends who think we're a bit misled. How can you spend 16 hours sitting listening to Wagner's music for the whole of the Ring, for example? They cannot grasp this idea. And it's because of the cliches, because of what you just mentioned, the fact that they have very prejudiced, very limited views of Wagner, and because of the problems that Wagner throws up, the Jewish question, the Hitler business, and all of this. He's a controversial guy, and nobody's ever been able to reconcile all of his aspects, really, although Wagnerism, this book, does a lot towards that. But yes, we do have that chip on the shoulder that you mentioned. It's almost as though we're being a little bit obsessive about something that they think is not that important. You remember at the start of my talk, I mentioned that little bit to Alex Ross. And I said, do we Wagnerists, do we get him out of perspective? And he said, well, you and I know, everybody knows who are Wagnerians, they know the effect that he had. But he went on to say, occasionally it gets forgotten. People don't remember the impact that he had, the wide impact. And the whole point of my talk, I suppose, was to try to show the width of that impact so that there would be a perspective, a Wagnerian perspective that we can all feel a part of and that we can help to let others see, was very important and very wide and very affecting too in our emotional lives and our intellectual lives. I think Alex's book gives us this perspective, this panorama that we can feel a part of and not feel kind of silly and out on the cold because we have a silly idiomatic obsession. It's not that at all. It's part of a cultural movement that we can constantly feel we're glad to be part of.
Well, I certainly, I hope that Alex's book moves us in that direction. Your second point was about modernism, and which can have 100 different interpretations, as we saw. That's between Nietzsche on the one end or Baudelaire on the other, and on it. You, as an expert on Wagner, to go back a little bit and talk about how Wagner might have seen himself as the birth of modernity and as an avant-garde artist, and the changes that he wrought in his art and his theories. Did he see himself as the birth of the modern?
Yeah, I think so, though I don't think he put it quite in that way. He certainly saw himself as bringing in an art which, as he constantly said, was an art of the future. That was a kind of quote from Feuerbach at the time, who wrote a book on the philosophy of the future. And the thing about Wagner was that the art that he was bringing in was not just music. It was drama and poetry and philosophy. And Brian McGee constantly said that Wagner is the only real major composer in the Western tradition who was so influenced by and so fascinated by philosophy, and for whom philosophy created a kind of musical, dramatic, artistic inspiration. And when Wagner was bringing his work to birth, he was trying to create a very wide context for it. When he talked about the music drama of the future, it wasn't just that he thought that he would one day be recognized. It wasn't just that. It was the kind of modernistic, um, what can I say, a kind of approach, a modernistic attitude that his work suggested. And I think he felt that that was the thing he loved about Baudelaire, that Baudelaire actually appreciated this modernism. And as Alex Ross has said, Wagner found Baudelaire as the first Wagnerian. Nietzsche actually said that he was the first intelligent Wagnerian. And I think Nietzsche was trying to suggest that we're not talking just music here. Yes, we're brought in by the music, by the wonder and the transforming power of the music. And Wagner himself said that his theatre was deeds of music made visible. And it's because of that wider influence, that wider ambience in his art, that modernism took over. What Nietzsche was saying was that Wagner was the beginning of modernism. Certainly he had roots in the past, but his music was different. And the difference could be espied, for example, with Tristan. Everybody used Tristan, quite rightly, as the jumping off point for modernism in music, because of the fact that tonality, which had been going for 200 years, tonality no longer underpinned everything that Wagner did. And it was a kind of symbol of something new starting off. And Wagner knew it was new. He knew it was the start of something. And yes, I think he thought of himself as the beginning of modernism, moving towards the future, not coming from the past.
It's always been interesting to me that Baudelaire, the father of the French symbolists, was the only one of that group who actually heard the music. I mean, the Mallarmé and the Verlaine and these people became Wagnerians in the Revue Wagnerienne without it, before they ever heard the music, which speaks of this theoretical power.
Yeah, that's true, but it's not quite the case. They did hear the music, because in Paris of the time, there were lots and lots of concerts, the Concert Lamoureux, the Concert Cologne, and so on, where Wagner's music was played over and over again. The interesting thing about Mallarmé and Mauclair and all these people of the Revue Wagnerienne, apart from this theoretical strength that they had, was that they went to these concerts and they created in their minds what they called a theatre of the imagination. And they constructed the stories in their minds out of the music. And that was a very impactful way of doing it. One wonders whether, had they gone to a fully staged performance of a Wagner opera, whether they'd have had the same experience or not. This way, the way they had to do it, through going to the music and just sitting at the concerts in a kind of transformed state, they made that experience their own. You remember I quoted that little bit from Baudelaire, who said, I had the experience que la musique c'était mienne, believed that it was my music.
Yeah.
And they took possession at these concerts of Wagner's music and created their own theatre out of that. That must have been a very impactful, very personal way of getting affected by Wagner's music.
Well, and that's true not only of them, but I think all of us, or many of us, have felt when we hear this music that it does belong to us, or even many have commented, I've heard this before, deep within myself, somehow. Could you talk about that?
Well, yes, you're right. Everybody experiences this. Wagner himself said in his 1861 book, Le Lettres sur la musique, which he made available to the French before Tannhäuser was played in Paris to such disarray, as you know. But he said that it was a question of déjà vu, of having already seen something in the past, as it were, and that when you come to his music, you get this sense of knowing that it's going to complete something which has already started in your head. Now, he said that that had something to do with the leitmotif, with the way in which he created the music in the past, as it were, in a previous act or a previous scene, or even just a previous moment. And when you heard it coming back again, you got this ecstatic flare up in your response to the music, because the leitmotif had done this. It created a symbol and it brought with it resonances that then ignited in your imagination. He was well aware of how he was doing this. And the leitmotif he knew, although he never used the word leitmotif himself, that was the way in which he kept on these little clues. For example, in Die Walküre, and he used this as an example himself, in Die Walküre, he knew that the theme for Freya, the goddess of beauty and falling in love and so on, that theme comes back at the beginning of the Valkyrie in a different way when the cello solo plays beautifully. And Siegmund and Sieglinde fall into, well, not each other's arms, but they fall in love. And that is because of the way in which Wagner had created in the past the music through Rheingold for Freya, the goddess of beauty. And Wagner knew he was doing it like that. And he also knew that that was how people felt, that that music was theirs. They knew that they'd heard it before, except they hadn't heard it in that particular way.
One of the tricks or devices Wagner used, in my opinion, was to foretell in a way a motive that would come to a fuller statement. Of course, they're always changing. But he'd give us a little glimpse of the future of that motive. Do you agree with that?
It's part of what I'm saying, I think. It's another
Yeah.
aspect of it. It's a kind of whole kind of experience. It's a resonance of experience. One of the things that drew me to Wagner was the fact that it wasn't just music. It was music and drama, music and theatre, music and poetic language. And the way in which it referred back and it hinted forward and it vibrated in the present as well was something I didn't get from many other composers. And I think I agreed with Baudelaire and Nietzsche that I'd found my element when I first got this lovely sense of being attracted finally to the essence of what Wagner was all about. And I think in Alex Ross's book on Wagnerism, he is parading, he is telling everybody this kind of secret element of Wagner and how it affected so many people over 150 years.
You also make the point, your third point, Wagnerism in America has now been awarded its due prominence. What does that mean? What do you think it means?
Well, I think that in the New World, we tended to think when Wagner first began to make himself known in the world, we tended to think of ourselves as being consumers of Wagnerism. The book by Joseph Horowitz, for example, is a kind of documentary study of, through the eyes of Anton Zaudel, Wagner performance, Wagner awareness, and so on, and how people were affected in America by Wagner, his ideas, and his music. And 1884, the fact in the Met Opera took over German repertoire, and Wagner in particular. We tend to think of ourselves in the New World as having been consumers of Wagnerism. I think what Alex Ross is telling us is that with America as the basic example, we are actually participants in Wagnerism. We're contributing to Wagnerism. And I think that was particularly true in America, that a new strand of Wagnerism grew. Owen Wister, for example, who wrote The Virginian, in his diary, he says, as he goes west, he says that everything reminds him of the set of Die Walküre. And a lot of people in America and other New World countries began to compare their experience on this kind of Wagnerian backcloth, as it were. And I think they felt that their experience could be valuable within Wagnerism. Alex Ross in his book constantly says that it's not a question of looking at Wagner through the culture of the time, but of looking at the culture of the time through Wagner as a lens. And I think people began to realize this, to realize that they were part of this cultural viewpoint. And I think America was one of the places where, more than ever, Wagnerism was something that had a positive aspect and a contribution to make. You know as well as I do that Wagner actually thought of coming to America, of settling here. And what he liked about it, you're going to love this, what he liked about it was the fact that it had no history, it had no background to, and that's the thing he loved about Bayreuth. It wasn't Berlin in the north, and it wasn't Munich in the south. It was a kind of no man's land. And Wagner actually said that he wanted Bayreuth to be like Washington in America, because it was a particular little place on its own, sheltered within DC, and it didn't have, it wasn't subject to all the pressures that cities were, and big cities often exerted on small cities. And he used the example of Washington to show that that's what he really wanted in Bayreuth as well. And I think that the American example, the two-headed side of it, the fact that it wasn't just a consumer, but that it had become a participant in the whole of the Wagner movement, was an important point that comes out in Alex's book.
And further on to that point, you talk about the updating of Wagner in the 20th and Wagnerism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Can you elaborate? It's a very complicated time we live in. We've seen very complicated Wagner productions, but can you elaborate on that Wagner in the 21st century and Wagnerism in the 21st century?
Yeah, Alex talks about the novels of Philip K. Dick. He talks about film, which is terribly important in the updating of it. And he talks about the cartoon, the little bit I played, the Bugs Bunny cartoon. There are classic elements that come in from very popular culture and very high culture. Wagner has always been associated with high culture, and a lot of people have been a bit snobbish about it and disregarded the ways in which Wagner appeared underneath in popular culture as well. One of the advantages of America was that it popularized Wagner. And one of the advantages of the 21st century is that Wagner has become a kind of commodity that turns itself towards everybody, towards the wider population. You mentioned about the performances, the Regie Theater, the way in which Wagner performances have been, to the scandalization of a lot of people, have been changed into something rich and strange, and something that Wagner himself might not even have recognized were he to come back. But I think that the advantage of Alex Ross's book is exactly this perspective that we talked about, this background, this panoply. We are not talking about something that affects just us and Wagner and the performances. We're talking about something that's got a huge background to it, a huge panorama. And when you and I see a performance of an opera that seems to be totally wrong to us, we have every right to feel annoyed by it, to feel enraged by it even, but it is still part of this huge 170 years of Wagnerism, this huge movement. And although we may see it as something very small, it's actually part of something very large. I felt that when I first saw the Chirot Ring, for example. I felt I couldn't understand it. I remember Donald McIntyre telling me that on the first week, they had the police and the fire brigade outside the theatre every night for a whole week. And then he said that within a year, it had become the classic performance of all time. And that's one thing that we understand about Wagnerism, that it is infinitely malleable. And I think Alex Ross's book helps to bear this out for the future. So that the updating for the 21st century, he goes over all these 21st century things like film and cartoons and so on, but he relates it to this big panoply of Wagnerism, which is something that now has been held up as a kind of ether, a kind of world in which we all feel ourselves inhabiting now. And so the updating is a specific kind of details of facts and fictions and so on, but it's part of the big picture. And his book gives us, if nothing else, the big picture. Even although the details are updated and fastened upon and discussed, the notion of Wagnerism, I think, has been expanded enormously. It's Wagnerism to the nth degree now.
Well, I have a confession to make about just that. As a conservative approach, and I've been outraged and enraged, as perhaps you have been, but it's taken me a long time to kind of understand that even the most radical interpretations, or whatever you want to call them, are in a way a tremendous compliment to Wagner, that these, at least the thinking directors, are coming to grips with something that is motivating them in these works of art. And they're trying to come up with something new, or they're compelled to come up with something new and different. And in a way I think Wagnerians should feel complimented by that, not as well as perhaps enraged from time to time.
Yeah, and I think that's what one of the major contributions of Alex's book is. It gives us this large background against which we can see the activity of Wagnerism, and we can find ourselves a place in this huge world of Wagnerism as we understand it now.
Well, I wanted to compliment you for the brilliant insight, I think, at the very beginning, to look at aspects of Wagner by Brian McGee as a seed for what Alex has done. And I've always thought that aspects of Wagner would be the first book somebody should read if they want to get into this subject. I don't know if you feel that way.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I once, in Dunedin, New Zealand, I gave a lecture on the beginnings of Wagnerism, really. And I said exactly what you've said. I said, if you really want to find your way into Wagner, the best book is by Brian McGee, called Aspects of Wagner. It's only 99 pages long, and it's got half a dozen chapters. At that stage, it was in its original version, and it had only 5 chapters. And you'll learn everything you need to know about the whole world of Wagnerism at the start. And I made a few different comments. Anyway, this man came up to me at the end of it, and he said, look, I enjoyed what you had said, and I particularly enjoyed that business about Brian McGee. I am Brian McGee. And suddenly I remembered that Dunedin had all these wonderful visitors coming to the University of Otago because it was well funded. And there was Brian McGee standing in front of me. And of course, I suddenly thought to myself, now, did I acknowledge him properly? Did I say everything right? And so, but he was wonderful. He was marvelous. And he made the point that he only had 100 pages for that book. And then about 20 years later, he did a book on Schopenhauer, it was just the philosophy of Schopenhauer. And at the end of it, he did an appendix on Wagner. And he said to me, while he was standing there with that twinkle in his eye, he said to me, the appendix on Wagner was about 3 times the size, well, not 3 times, but was about a third as much again of the size of my whole book on Wagner in 19...
Will, there, I lost you there for a minute. It's tempting to think what the world would have been like and America would have been like had Wagner come to Washington, D.C. And that's speculative. But what's not speculative, Heath, is my sincere hope and the hope of all of the members of the Wagner Society of Washington, D.C., that you will come back to Washington, D.C. and spend some time with us. Will you promise to do that?
I will remember the last time when I had that wonderful theatre and a very lovely accepting audience. And yes, I'd be delighted to do that. I'd love to come back there.
Well, before you change your mind, I'll say thank you, and good night to all. Thanks, Heath.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.